Akedah, Genesis chapter 22, verse 1 to 19. The sacrifice of Isaac, binding of Isaac. In the Holy Scriptures, the first covenant began between God and Abraham to form the people of God, the people of Israel. Abraham was the first to affirm the existence of the one, or the belief in only one, God, because before this people worshiped many gods. Abraham was initially known as Abraham, but was renamed Abraham by God, which means father of many nations, after the treaty formed or covenant to God. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac in Genesis chapter 22, verse 1 to 19, shows the climate events in Abraham's life. Sometimes later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Verse 9 plays a big part in the ultimate trial of faith of the age, patriarch to sacrifice his son Isaac. This verse 9 has a root meaning, bound, or divine. In Hebrew, verb is akad, from which is derived the noun Akedah, the binding of Isaac, the traditional Jewish name for this incident. To our surprise, the story is far from being divulged to the reader, ordered not to Abraham, so that we can avoid any misunderstanding of God, put Abraham to the test of faith and require human sacrifice. There are some gaps narrated in the story. In verse 1, he said, the conversation of God to Abraham in a night dream or a vision. In verse 2, here I am, in the Hebrew word Haneni, we see that the only word Abraham utters to respond to God's call in the entire episode shows a great attitude of conscious receptivity. We find a rich literature on this passage in the Jewish tradition. An essential part of it is found in the Midrashim commentaries called Haggadah, that is, commentaries on the scriptures that are not normative but the extract spiritual teaching for the people from the text of the scriptures. In the case of the Akedah of Isaac, we have a typical example of this commentary Haggadah on Genesis 21. The text says that God spoke to Abraham. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac. To the attentive ear reading it, one notices an unnecessary repetition. God could have directly told Abraham, Take Isaac and go. But because God presented three specifications, the Jewish tradition will introduce an imaginary dialogue between God and Abraham. Your son Ishmael was also Abraham's son, the only son. Each was unique with their respective wives. The one you loved certainly Abraham bought Isaac. Now it's clear, but it was not clear at the beginning of God's request to Abraham. I cite another example from the Haggadah, constructed from the expression that God tempted Abraham. The sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis chapter 22, verse 1 to 19. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Sefer Haggadah, the book of Jewish folklore and legend, on page 39, base 44. On the day that Isaac was weaned, Abraham made a lavish banquet for all his friends and neighbors. Satan said to God, "This old man, Abraham, at 100 years, was blessed with son, yet from all his peace, which he made for his friends, he couldn't find a single dove or little pigeon to offer to you." God said, "He has done everything for his son. Yet, if I asked him to sacrifice his son to me, he would immediately do so." And Satan said, "Test him and see." Whereupon the Bible immediately goes on to say, God did prove Abraham. We can see different passable stories based on Jewish Haggadah. We can also see in the book of the legends of the Jewish Sam Midrash that explain the pledge for Isaac's life. And it is he who is sent to restrain Abraham from slaying Isaac. Given that Sarah's death is already announced in the sequence of the Akedah accounts. The Haggadah will fill in what is not said and therefore construct an imaginary dialogue between Satan and Sarah, in which Satan announces to Sarah that Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac, and Sarah, upon hearing this news, dies. This is to explain why, when Abraham returned from Mount Moriah, he took care of Sarah's burial. The binding of Isaac by Abraham conformed with the law, which prescribed the binding of a sacrifice before its slaughter. Why so much detail in the story? Why does the book have two versions, Hebrew and Old Greek? Why, after sacrifice on Mount Moriah, was carried to paradise by angels, and there he sojourned for 3 years? Does Abraham return home alone? When Sarah beheld him, she exclaimed, "Satan spoke the truth when he said that Isaac was sacrificed." and so grieved was her soul that it fled from her body. Our narrative analysis will help clarify more. The limitation of the text or context. Genesis chapter 22 verse 1 and 19 is a passage from the Hebrew Bible, specifically from the book of Genesis, the first book of the Pentateuch or the Torah. The passage is called the binding of Isaac or the Akedah in Jewish tradition. It is located within the larger context of the life of Abraham, who is considered the father of the Israelite nations. The passage came from after God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah, promising them descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and precedes the birth of Isaac, the son of promise. The temporal and spatial settings, when and where. The story of Abraham and the patriarchs is a theological text before being a historical text. It reflects the change from the polytheistic world to the monotheistic world, in which Abraham is the model for this beginning. The story is not based on a written text from the period it refers to, but only much later, with the beginning of writing, that the people of Israel, already constituted as a people, would tell the story retroactively. The story therefore reflects a distant past that was transmitted orally, and that at the time of writing an update of the transmitted stories is made. Jewish tradition places the place of sacrifice, Akedah, on Mount Moriah, where the temple would be built as a dwelling place of God and a sacrifice. This teaches us that the period in which the text was written is based on the existence of the temple and its centrality to the religious life of Israel. Therefore, the sacrifice of Isaac will be retroactively located where the temple was already functioning. The plot. What? In scene 1, a divine monologue. Here I am, Hanani. And in scene 2, departure. No feelings of Abraham is mentioned. The reader is invited to imagine the inner feelings, expresses an attitude of conscious receptivity and response. Scene 3, dialogue at the foot of the mountain between Abraham and two of his servants. Scene 4, dialogue between Abraham and Isaac climbing the mountain. The two walk out together. That shows perfect harmony between father and son. The plot what in scene 5, after the 4 short preparatory scenes, The narrator slows down the narration for the climatic scenes on the mountain top, and they arrive at the place. Scene 6. God acknowledged Abraham's fidelity. We can see from the scene 6 matches with scene 1, the divine monologue. Conclusion. Reaffirmation of the blessings in verse 15 to 18. Because Abraham has demonstrated his willingness to forfeit his posterity in obedience to God's will. Much is left unsaid about Isaac and Sarah, but some Akedah and the book of Jewish folklore and legend explain and give us the other window of the story. The plot what? Exposition in Genesis 22, verse 1. The story begins with God testing Abraham by commanding him to take his son Isaac, whom he loves, to the land of Mount Moriah and offer him a burnt offering on a mountain that God will show him. This sets up the initial conflict and tension in the story as Abraham faces a complex and seemingly contradictory command from God. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Inciting moment on the verse 3 of chapter 22. Obedience to God and love for his son are in diametrically opposing directions. Abraham obeys God without hesitation and starts the journey with Isaac and two of his servants. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Complication. As they reached the mountain, Isaac asked him about the lamb for the burnt offering, to which Abraham responds that God will provide. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said. "But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Climax. Abraham binds Isaac, places him on the altar, and raises his knife to slaughter him as an offering to God. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on the top of the wood. Resolution. A call to him from heaven. At the lowest moment, an angel of the Lord stops Abraham and provides a ram caught in a thicket as substitute for Isaac. Abraham sacrifices the ram instead, and the angel reaffirms God's blessing on Abraham and his descendants. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am. He replied, Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Conclusion. Abraham names the place, The Lord will provide. Adonai Yere. On the mount of the Lord there is vision, and with his servants they return to Beersheba. So Abraham called the place, The Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. How is it presented? Examine the point of view, focalization, or panorama in the text. How is it presented? The passage is presented from an omniscient third-person point of view. Abraham and Isaac's thoughts, emotions, and actions are described by the panorama remains external, allowing the reader to observe the events from a detached perspective. Character study. Who and why? The main characters in the passage are Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is depicted as a faithful and obedient servant of God, willing to obey even the most complex and challenging command. He demonstrates his trust in God's provision in his unwavering faith. On the other hand, Isaac is portrayed as a willing and obedient son who submits to his father's authority and trusts him, even as he is being prepared for sacrifice. The role and function of the reader, theology. The reader is invited to reflect on faith, obedience, and trust in God's providence. The passage raises ethical and theological questions about the nature of sacrifice, the limits of obedience, and the complexities of human relationship with God. The reader is prompted to consider The implication of Abraham's willingness to offer his son as a sacrifice and how his faith and obedience are rewarded by God's intervention. The passage also foreshadows the concept of substitution sacrifice, but with the additional remarks that Isaac gave up his life at the appearance of the Shekinah, which becomes a significant theme in later biblical and Jewish Christian traditions and theology. Conclusion. The Akedah, or binding of Isaac, is a story from the Bible in Genesis 22, verse 1 to 19. It tells how God asked Aaron to sacrifice his son Isaac, whom he had in his old age. Abraham obeyed and took Isaac to the place of sacrifice. He bound Isaac on the altar. The Hebrew word "bayakud" is used to describe this act of binding, and it appears only in the story in the Bible. Just as Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, an angel of the Lord stopped him and told him to spare his son. Instead, God provided a ram to be sacrificed in Isaac's place. The Akedah symbolizes self-sacrifice and obedience to God's will in Jewish thought and has become a powerful symbol of Jewish martyrdom throughout history. The Akedah binding of Isaac is a profound and influential narrative in Christianity and Judaism, offering rich theological insight for believers each faith. Early interpretations of the Akedah in Christianity highlight its significance as a prefiguration of Jesus' sacrifice. Church fathers like Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria established essential connections between the two events, enriching Christian understanding of sacrifice and redemption. To the present time, believers and followers, the Akedah, the finding of Isaac, was a sign of a fertile text for inculcating religious and ethical values. Once before, this story teaches that everything must be sacrificed to God, if needs be, how much more then man must be willing to give up his lusts, power, wealth, and more for God. In the future, moreover, whenever man has opportunity to do good or refrain from evil, he should reflect that perhaps God is testing him at that moment, as he tested like Father Abraham. At last, Christians call it the sacrifice of Isaac, and Jews call it the binding of Isaac, but it was a sign of a fertile text for inculcating religious and ethical values. Thank you.